Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! A woman and child sit within sight of a home they could no longer reach after a new border cut through the land in the late 1940s. The Green Line later separated many Palestinian families from houses, fields, and relatives on the other side. A United States Army soldier loses control during a chemical drill while masked troops move through the haze behind him. The photo was reportedly blocked by censors and dated 1914. Near Saigon, discarded South Vietnamese uniforms lined the road as troops changed into civilian clothes and tried to blend into the crowd. On April 30, 1975, this happened during the final hours before Saigon came under North Vietnamese control. One of cinema's wildest stunts caught Buster Keaton standing still as a whole house front crashed around him and only the open window saved him. In 1928, the falling facade weighed about 2 tons, and the mark had to be exact within inches. A deposed ruler and his wife are rushed from a military room as Romania's old order breaks in real time. On December 25, 1989, a fast tribunal in Târgoviște marked the final collapse of the country's communist rule. A priest stands over a public ceremony as a Serb family kneels before a silent crowd in wartime Croatia. In 1941, the independent state of Croatia pushed many Serbs to change religion under state pressure. Christine Chubbuck appears on air moments before one of the most infamous moments in United States television history. In 1974, the Florida news anchor died during a live broadcast, and the original footage was never publicly released. Mickey Cohen sits in front of a wall of headlines that made him one of the most photographed underworld figures in Los Angeles. In 1949, Life magazine sent Ed Clark to spend a day with him, turning his public image into a portrait of pure press obsession. On Guam, a captured Japanese soldier covers his face after hearing that Japan had surrendered. In 1945, many Japanese heard Emperor Hirohito's voice for the first time when he announced the end of the war. A Bergen taxi driver runs through the street with a cushion over his head as German air raids hit Norway. In 1940, Bergen was attacked soon after the German invasion began on April 9th. Winston Churchill gives his famous victory sign in Bradford, but the hand is turned the wrong way for Britain. On December 4, 1942, he was still using the palm inversion and only changed it in 1943 after a secretary explained its meaning. Tomsk students pose on the snow in early spring, and the scene looks almost unreal with bare torsos in Siberian cold. The photo was taken on April 9, 1936, in Tomsk, where snow often lasted well into spring. The tree of Tenere stood so alone in the Sahara that it became a map mark and a guide for caravans crossing open desert. In 1973, a truck knocked down the roughly 300-year-old acacia in Niger, and its remains were later placed in the National Museum of Niger. Marilyn Monroe kneels among young fans in a photo that captures how quickly she was becoming a national sensation in 1952. The image was taken in Atlantic City on August 25, 1952, during a publicity stop for one of her film releases that year. This cloud rose over Yucca Flat during the first atomic test ever shown live on television. On April 22, 1952, people in the United States watched the Nevada test from their homes. Workers handle chlorine cylinders in a scene linked to the first large battlefield chemical attack of World War I. On April 22, 1915, German forces released chlorine near Ypres and opened a gap of about 6 kilometers in the Allied line. The first Harley-Davidson prototype looked humble, but one of its most famous parts was a carburetor made from a tomato can. In 1903, that rough machine became the starting point of one of the most recognizable motorcycle brands in history. 3 Afghan Mujahideen pose in Soviet-made gas masks, giving the 1984 photo an almost unreal look. It was taken during the Soviet-Afghan War, and the masks are GP5 models originally designed for Soviet civilians. American bombers crossed the sky as their falling loads marked the first United States heavy strike on Germany. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force flew from England to hit Wilhelmshaven, the main German naval port on the North Sea. Albert Einstein arrives in the United States after leaving Nazi Germany, turning the world's most famous scientist into a refugee. On October 17, 1933, he reached America and never returned to live in Germany. Benito Mussolini studies a tracked armored vehicle at a military factory in Genoa as fascist Italy poured money into rearmament. The photo was taken on May 18, 1938, just over 1 year before Italy entered World War II. German infantry worked behind a protected machine gun position on the Vistula front during the first months of World War I. In 1914, control of the Vistula line helped decide whether German forces could push deeper into Russian Poland. The Holt gas-electric tank looked like a riveted steel box on tracks and became one of the strangest early armored vehicles in the United States. Built during World War I, it used a gasoline engine to power electric motors instead of a normal mechanical drive. A wristwatch with a hidden micro camera turned an everyday object into a tiny spy tool in 1949. Devices like this showed how fast miniature cameras were shrinking after World War II, making secret photography easier than ever. These experimental aircraft helmets made United States airmen look like visitors from the future long before modern flight gear existed. Tested in 1918, they were built for open cockpit crews facing freezing wind, noise, and flying debris. These children stood outside a North Carolina mill in 1912 at an age when many American textile workers were still not even teenagers. Child labor stayed common in United States factories until federal limits finally arrived in 1938. A British Spitfire ends up almost standing on its nose after a rough landing on the deck of HMS Implacable. During World War II, most Spitfires were built for land bases, so carrier landings like this were unusual and difficult. One of the strangest World War II sights was a donkey fitted to carry German anti-tank gear. In the 1940s, armies still depended on animals to move weapons and supplies where trucks could not go. A South Vietnamese soldier in Quang Nam carries so many grenades that his uniform looks more like a storage belt than standard field gear. Quang Nam was one of the hardest-fought provinces of the Vietnam War, and soldiers there often adapted their equipment for close jungle combat. Robert Wadlow stands so tall that even a woman on a ladder barely reaches him, and he remains the tallest person in recorded history at 8 feet 11 inches. By his high school graduation, he was already 8 feet 4 inches tall. London window cleaners balance on tall ladders in 1917, turning an ordinary street into a striking wartime work scene. During World War I, many women moved into jobs once held by men, and Britain saw that shift in streets, shops, and factories. Red Army soldiers take their oath on Red Square before leaving Moscow for the front, with the Kremlin rising behind them like a final witness. In November 1941, German forces were already near the capital, and some units left the square and went straight into battle. In 1921, Damascus orphaned girls worked at a carpet loom in the courtyard of the Hamieh House, learning a craft that could also keep them alive. The photo was taken in Syria only a few years after the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the region was being remade. German women sweep a ruined Berlin street in 1945 under the eye of Marusia Kuznetsova, a Soviet woman forced to work in Germany for more than 2 years. After Germany's surrender, clearing rubble became part of daily life in a city smashed by war. On a narrow raft in Brazil, an explorer travels with an indigenous guide whose river knowledge could decide whether a journey through the Amazon moved forward at all. Taken in 1910, the image comes from an era when much of the Amazon was still poorly mapped by outsiders. A London newspaper seller walks with the headline that told Britain the new European crisis had become a world war. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany 2 days after the invasion of Poland. The Northrop XB-35 looked decades ahead of its time, a giant flying wing with no normal fuselage or tail. Rolled out for tests in California in 1946, it never entered service, but its shape later pointed toward aircraft, like the B-2. Two aircraft fly so close that the sky itself becomes a fuel station, with a hose linking them high over Britain. In 1938, British crews were already testing air-to-air refueling, a method that could keep aircraft flying far longer than their tanks allowed. Blindfolded tasters at the United States Department of Agriculture judged food without seeing its color, shape, or packaging. In 1935, tests like this helped the government compare products more fairly during the Great Depression. Stalin and Trotsky walk in the same funeral procession for Felix Dzerzhinsky, capturing a Soviet power circle that would soon break apart. Taken in July 1926, the crowd also included Molotov, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, and several figures in this frame later fell in Stalin's purges. 3 moon mission astronauts sit with Jim Lovell's family, watching the Apollo 13 crisis unfold on television instead of from inside the spacecraft. In April 1970, an oxygen tank failure turned the mission into a survival drama watched by millions around the world. Gun shop workers stop their shift and crowd around a portable radio to hear Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorial service in 1968. His funeral in Atlanta reached millions across the United States, and even noisy workrooms like this fell silent for it. Frozen horses drag a wagon through the whiteout of the Eastern Front during one of the bleakest moments of Operation Barbarossa. In the winter of 1941, German forces near Moscow were slowed by extreme cold, broken transport, and supply lines collapsing in snow and ice. The Marjorie Glen became a blackened wreck at Punta Loyola after a coal cargo fire turned the 1892 sailing ship into a stranded shell. Lost on September 14, 1911, the Hulk was still standing in 1982 when Argentine pilots used it for target practice during the Falklands War. Londoners used homemade periscopes to watch King George VI's coronation over the crowd. On May 12, 1937, the packed London streets turned cardboard viewers into one of the day's strangest sights. A fake head made from scrap materials helped fool guards during the most famous Alcatraz escape. In 1962, prisoners on the Island Prison in San Francisco Bay shaped it from soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, and wall dust. During World War II, military mail became a hidden security problem because soldiers sent home huge numbers of letters. One simple fix was delay. By the time many letters arrived, any useful field details were already out of date. Early swimming lessons could look like this, with students suspended in harnesses to practice strokes before entering the water. In the early 1900s, some schools used these overhead rigs as a dry land way to teach swimming motions. An Ottoman street stall turned stacked meat on a vertical spit in a scene that looks surprisingly modern. Dated 1855, the image is often described as one of the earliest photographs linked to shawarma. This United States escape kit carried gold and a watch meant to buy help after a crash or forced landing. From World War II to Vietnam, some airmen were issued valuables to trade for freedom behind enemy lines. A worker sits inside a giant spiral turbine that makes the 1928 machine look almost unreal in scale. Built in Germany for a power plant in Norway, it was rated at 9,000 horsepower. A sauropod leg towered so high that museum workers needed ladders just to assemble it indoors. At the American Museum of Natural History, mounts like this turned dinosaur bones into some of the largest displays ever built. RMS Oceanic looked enormous even before launch, and in 1899 she became the longest ship in the world. On January 14, 1899, more than 50,000 people watched her leave the Harland and Wolff Yard in Belfast. A man on Maui stands among leaves so huge he looks almost miniature beside them. Taken in 1924, the the photo turns tropical plant growth into something that feels almost unreal. Kamloops looked like a real Cold War submarine shrunk just enough to fit a lake. In 1967, the 70-foot research model was launched on Lake Pend Oreille in Idaho to test submarine design. Workers built the giant Glory to Labor statue before it rose over Yerevan as one of Soviet Armenia's strangest monuments. Built in 1982, it was demolished in 1997. In 1965, workers closed the last gap of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis only when the steel lined up at the right temperature. At 195 meters tall, the arch had to be joined at a precise time of day because sun heat made the metal expand. Clark Street in 1871 looked almost unrecognizable after the Great Chicago Fire tore through more than 3 square miles of the city. The fire began on October 8, 1871, and left long stretches of Chicago as empty streets, broken walls, and brick shells. In 1947, a captured German 5-2 rocket rolled through Aylesbury like it did not belong on an ordinary town street. It was being taken to Royal Air Force Halton 2 years after the war, when Britain was studying 5-2 technology. Germany's 30,000-ton Schlomann closed-die press was one of the most powerful forging machines of its time. With 30,000 tons of force, it could shape huge steel parts that smaller presses simply could not make. The mechanical shark from Jaws became famous partly because it kept failing during the making of the 1975 film. Those breakdowns forced the movie to show the shark far less than planned, which shaped the suspense people still remember. In 1932, a woman stood beside one of the giant pipes of the Royal Albert Hall organ in London, an instrument that once ranked as the largest in the world. Built in 1871, it originally had 111 stops and more than 9,000 pipes. Workers stood on the curved frame of this giant aviary while it was still open to the sky, turning a bird enclosure into something that looked almost unreal in size. In the late 1800s, large aviaries were often built with iron ribs and wire mesh. In 1940, Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford posed between takes before the film that began one of Hollywood's most famous screen pairings. The lady in question was their first movie together, and they reunited again in Gilda in 1946. In 1943, some residents of Stalingrad used damaged aircraft as temporary shelter because large parts of the city had no livable housing left. In the ruins of Stalingrad, even broken fuselages were turned into places to sleep. An ordinary street board became a propaganda weapon when Der Stürmer was placed in public view for people to read in Nazi Germany. Founded in 1923, the paper ran until 1945 and became one of the regime's main tools for spreading anti-Jewish propaganda. In 1939, a Russian electric tractor moved over glass-covered hotbeds and looked more like a rail machine than a farm vehicle. It was designed to handle 22 jobs, including opening and closing the frames while moving from row to row. The Ford Mustang made its public debut at the New York World's Fair in 1964, looking more like a dream car than something ordinary buyers could actually afford. Its base price was $2,368, and Ford sold more than 22,000 on the first day. Before it became one of the world's most famous burgers, the Big Mac began as a local test item at McDonald's. It first went on sale in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, in 1967 after franchise owner Jim Delegati created it. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward married in Las Vegas in 1958 and became one of Hollywood's rare couples to last for half a century. Their marriage lasted 50 years, ending only when Newman died in 2008. In 1958, Elvis Presley went from the biggest star in America to an ordinary recruit in one of the most surprising turns of his career. At 6:35 in the morning on March 24, 1958, he reported in Memphis. The jump in size looked shocking in 1923 when Firestone began regular production of balloon tires and made older car tires seem suddenly ancient. Their wider body used lower air pressure for a smoother ride, helping change what cars would feel like on the road. In 1888, the Great Blizzard turned city streets into narrow snow tunnels and made whole neighborhoods look buried. The storm began on March 11, 1888, shut down commerce along the eastern seaboard, and became one of the most disruptive blizzards in United States history. Richard Avedon turned a Paris street into high fashion in 1948 by placing Balenciaga model Elise Daniels among local performers in Le Marais. Shot in 1948, the image became one of his most striking early fashion photographs because it mixed couture with ordinary street life. In 1941, a New York rally showed that some Americans still wanted peace with Hitler and opposed United States entry into the war. The protest took place months before the United States entered World War II in December 1941. Around 1954, the Volkswagen Beetle moved through Wolfsburg in long, near-identical rows, with painted bodies lowered from overhead conveyors onto the assembly line below. The oval rear window version was built in the 1950s. In 1906, limestone miners in Degerham on Öland, Sweden, stood in work goggles beside a hand-loaded cart, making the scene look far more modern than its date. Quarry work still depended on manual digging, shovels, and wheelbarrows to move heavy stone. In 1905, Lombardi's opened in Little Italy, New York, and is widely credited as the first licensed pizzeria in the United States. What began as a small neighborhood shop helped turn pizza from an immigrant street food into an American classic. In 1947, Sam Shaw photographed an underwater fashion scene in Miami, with models posing on the seafloor as a shark passed above them. In 1967, Soviet hockey players walked through Vienna in full gear, carrying their own bags, looking more like workers than world stars. The World Championship in Vienna came during the Soviet Union's dominant era, when its team was becoming one of the strongest forces in international hockey. Around 1925, racing driver Ivy Cummings showed that early motoring demanded strength as much as speed. She is changing the wheel on a 1925 Singer in London when many drivers still had to handle roadside repairs by hand. Mid-century child car seats often looked more like metal frames than protective seats, built to keep children upright and easy for adults to watch. Early designs were meant mainly to keep children in place or raise them higher, while dedicated child seat safety standards came decades later. In 1972, chimney sweeps in East Germany still wore the black coat and top hat of a trade that looked older than the modern city around them. Across Europe, chimney sweeps were long seen as symbols of good luck, and that old image survived for generations. Zurich police in 1983 carried woven wicker shields that looked centuries old, even in a modern city protest. The photo was taken during major student protests in Zurich, when these light round shields were still used for crowd control. In 1993, Russian politics looked raw and chaotic, and moments like this made the country's power struggle feel almost unbelievable. That year, Moscow faced a major constitutional crisis during one of the harshest economic and political transitions of the post-Soviet era. In 1986, singer Lev Leshchenko was photographed in Kabul during a visit to Soviet servicemen, far from the concert stage that made him famous. The image comes from the final years of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. In 1954, designers at the Gorky automobile plant were shaping the full-size model of the first Volga Gaz-21 before it ever reached the road. The Volga entered production in 1956 and became one of the best-known passenger cars of the Soviet era. In 1991, Domodedovo Airport Security photographed a table of restricted items taken from passengers, a scene that feels almost unreal today. The image was made in Moscow during the final year of the Soviet Union. In 1990, Mike Tyson and Naomi Campbell looked like two of the most recognizable faces of a new decade captured in one frame. That year, Tyson was still one of the biggest names in boxing, while Campbell was rising into one of the defining supermodels of the 1990s. According to the caption, this 1971 photo shows a 19-year-old judo trainee in Leningrad, years before politics turned him into a global figure. Judo stayed central to his public image for decades and was often presented as part of his disciplined early life. In 1942, even a small cat became valuable in Leningrad, where protecting food could mean survival. Around 5,000 cats were later brought into the city to control rats and help save remaining food supplies. According to the caption, this shows Sergei Mavrodi in the 1990s, when post-Soviet Russia was producing some of its most unreal public figures. He soon became tied to MMM, the investment empire that drew millions of people. In 1994, Hillary Clinton brought humanitarian aid to Belarus during Operation Provide Hope. The program sent food and medicine to former Soviet states during the post-Soviet crisis. During Prohibition, Americans still crowded into hidden bars even after alcohol was banned nationwide in 1920. The ban lasted until 1933 and helped build a huge bootlegging trade across the United States. One of the last photos of Lenin was taken in 1923 after repeated strokes had ended his active role in Soviet politics. He left active politics that year and died in 1924. On March 10, 1945, a single-night air raid turned large parts of Tokyo into ruins. The attack killed about 80,000 to 100,000 people and became one of the deadliest air raids in history. In 1994, goods were often sold in Moscow, straight from truck beds and car trunks. The scene came from Russia's post-Soviet crisis years, when informal street trade filled gaps left by collapsing state shops. In January 1941, Dubat troops from Italian Somaliland stood in formation during an Italian flag raising in North Africa. The Dubats were colonial irregulars recruited in East Africa and used by Italy in campaigns across the region. The Machi C-205 was one of Italy's best late war fighters, and some flew with German markings after Italy's 1943 armistice. Powered by a Daimler-Benz engine, it remained in combat in 1944 and 1945 under both Italian and German control. In 1937, Ethiopians deported during the Italian occupation were photographed in Longobucco, Calabria, far from their homeland. Italy used deportation to weaken resistance in occupied Ethiopia. A United States Marine sergeant stands on Pavuvu on November 11, 1944, during the Pacific Campaign. One of the oldest Marines in his battalion, he later inspired the character Gunny Haney in the Pacific. In 1899, Chief Wolf Robe was photographed wearing a Benjamin Harrison Peace Medal, a symbol once given by the United States to Native leaders. Harrison left office in 1893, so the medal was already a relic of an earlier era when this portrait was made. A 1996 wedding photo captures a couple at the cake cutting in classic mid-1990s style. In 1996, most wedding photos were still shot on film and usually seen only after the negatives were developed. In 1900, Louis Firetail of Crow Creek was photographed at Hampton Institute in Virginia during the era of forced assimilation schools for Native students. Hampton trained indigenous students in Euro-American education while often suppressing their languages and traditions. Blanche Dumas was born in Martinique in 1860 and later became a sideshow performer in Europe. She was born with a parasitic twin that left her with an extra leg and extra internal organs, and doctors described her in medical journals of the time. The Windscale fire in 1957 became the worst nuclear accident in United Kingdom history. It was later rated level 5 on the 7-point International Nuclear Event Scale. Carson Walks Over Ice completed 3 of the 4 sacred tasks tied to becoming a Crow war chief while serving in Vietnam. Elders refused the title because he returned with 2 elephants instead of a horse. In November 1943, Japan gathered leaders from its allied and puppet states at the Greater East Asia Conference in Tokyo. The meeting was meant to show Japanese leadership in Asia, even though several of these governments existed under Japanese military control. In 1975, the SS Mayaguez became the center of a sudden international crisis off Cambodia. Khmer Rouge forces seized the merchant ship, and the confrontation became one of the last United States military actions of the Vietnam era. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments, which historical shot did you like the most, and for what reason? In 1941, near Moscow, tank commander Alexander Mardakayev kept fighting after his tank was hit and caught fire. His crew stopped 3 tanks and 2 anti-tank guns, and he was later awarded the Order of Lenin. On April 22, 1944, the Sikorsky R-4 became the first helicopter used in wartime rescue missions. The first Air Commando Group flew it in the China-Burma-India theater, opening a new era in air rescue. In 1898, the United States Congress passed the Volunteer Army Act and created the first volunteer cavalry, later known as the Rough Riders. Led by Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt, the unit became one of the most famous volunteer forces of the Spanish-American War. In 1934, federal agents tried to catch John Dillinger at Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin. The raid failed, Dillinger escaped, and the operation became one of the most famous early FBI failures. In 1963, the Soviet Altai system appeared as one of the earliest mobile radio telephone networks, a decade before Motorola's famous handheld phone. It was first used by top officials, then by ambulance crews, fire services, and police, and it was used heavily during the 1980 Olympics. In 1983, one of the world's biggest music stars was photographed on a regular commercial flight during the Sirius Moonlight Tour. The tour followed Let's Dance and became the biggest tour of his career up to that point. In 1943, a captured German officer handed his Iron Cross to a United States Coast Guardsman during transport from North Africa. The scene came after the Axis defeat in Tunisia, when huge numbers of prisoners were being moved out of the campaign. In August 1944, a woman machinist was photographed doing precision factory work during the wartime production surge. During World War II, millions of women entered industrial jobs to keep military production running. In 1989, East German, West German, and Nigerian police officers stood together during the United Nations mission in Namibia. The mission helped oversee the transition to independence, and Namibia became independent in 1990. In May 1946, Ichiro Hatoyama was blocked from taking power just as he was forming a cabinet after Japan's first post-war general election. American occupation authorities barred him from public office that day, reshaping early post-war Japanese politics. HMS Edinburgh went down in the Barents Sea in 1942 while carrying 5 tons of Soviet gold. In 1981, salvors recovered 431 of its 465 gold bars from about 800 feet below the surface. In 1932, soldiers stood in Mensala after the failed rebellion that tried to bring down Finland's government. The coup attempt was led by the Lapua movement and collapsed before it could seize power. On January 29, 1944, the USS Missouri was launched at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It became the last battleship commissioned by the United States Navy. By 1922, Smedley Butler was already one of the most decorated Marines in United States history. He received 2 Medals of Honor, a distinction held by only a tiny number of service members. In 1941, Royal Air Force bombs hit the Italian-held airport at Asmara during the East African Campaign. Asmara was the capital of Italian Eritrea, and Italy's East African Empire collapsed later that year. In these frozen high mountains, a Schwarzlose crew worked behind a wall of snow where every part, every belt, and every drop of cooling water had to be carried uphill by hand. The Schwarzlose entered service in 1907. This 1850 daguerreotype preserved the face of a man whose name later became a national shockwave in the United States. Daguerreotypes were one-of-a-kind images on silvered copper. By April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt had forced a drastic change in tactics, and whole streets were turned into smoke and fire after direct assaults failed. Reports of the uprising reached London within days, and resistance from bunkers and hidden passages continued for nearly a month. Sikorsky's Ilya Muromets looked almost impossible for 1913, with 4 engines, a closed cabin, and a size far beyond most aircraft of its time. It began as a giant passenger plane and soon became one of the world's first successful 4-engine military aircraft. Mayakovsky bought this Renault in Paris for Lily Brick, making the car part of one of the most famous love stories in Soviet art. Rodchenko photographed it in Moscow in 1929, linking 3 major names of Russian culture in one frame. Taken in Berlin in 1945, this close view catches a young Soviet soldier at the moment the red banner was being raised over the Reichstag. The Reichstag had long stood as a symbol of German state power, so the flag above it became one of the strongest signs of Berlin's fall. Barcelona in 1936 produced images that still feel startling, and armed women like this became one of the boldest symbols of the Spanish conflict's first months. By late 1936, Barcelona was a main Republican stronghold. In Bethlehem in 1988, this masked Palestinian Christian was photographed during the First Intifada while wearing a sweatshirt printed with the face of Jesus. The First Intifada began in 1987, and Bethlehem became one of the best-known Palestinian centers of unrest in the occupied West Bank. During a 1926 United States tour, wrestler Ivan Podobny was photographed with Ilya Tolstoy, the son of Leo Tolstoy, turning one casual moment into a meeting of Russian sport and Russian literature. Podobny was already in his 50s by then. In 1941, Jewish women and children in Lithuania were photographed under auxiliary guard as normal life collapsed almost overnight. One of Eastern Europe's oldest Jewish communities was shattered in that same year after centuries of life in the region. In San Francisco in 1969, women's liberation activists turned a simple bra into a public symbol of rules they wanted to break. The phrase bra burning spread worldwide after protests like this, even though many demonstrations focused on symbolic rejection rather than actual burning. In Denmark in 1930, a street parade rolled out a large wagon of Odin, bringing Norse mythology into the middle of everyday city life. Odin was the highest god in old Scandinavian belief, so placing him above the crowd turned the procession into a public show of national legend. In 1982, near Novy Urengoy, Soviet builders painted a blunt message to Ronald Reagan across a giant gas pipe. This line was part of the huge Siberian network that tied Soviet gas to Europe and turned energy into politics. In 1905, girls at the Serpukhov Women's Gymnasium studied geometry under the eyes of both a teacher and a class supervisor. At a time when higher study for girls was still limited in the Russian Empire, a room like this marked a real shift in education. Freddie Mercury treated his cats like family, and Delilah was one of the most loved in his home. He called her his princess and gave her a song on the 1991 album Innuendo. In Budapest in 1945, Lieutenant Moise Karchava was photographed reporting to headquarters by field telephone as the city burned around him. Street fighting there lasted for weeks, and keeping one phone line alive could decide the next move. One man rushing a royal car turned Congo's independence ceremony into one of 1960's most striking images when a ceremonial sword was snatched in front of the crowd. The photo was taken on the 30th of June, 1960, in Leopoldville, the day Congo became independent from Belgium. In early 20th century England, a Magdalen laundry could look orderly and clean while hiding a life of endless washing, ironing, and strict control. Many women were sent there not for crime, but for poverty, pregnancy, or simply being judged improper. Afghanistan became a hard lesson for one great power after another, and scenes like this came to symbolize that pattern. Britain entered in 1839, the Soviet Union in 1979, and the United States in 2001. In Kansas in 1897, a lone house sat so deep in the prairie that it nearly disappeared into the horizon. On the Great Plains, settlers often lived miles from the next building, with grassland and sky stretching in every direction. These plain Zyklon B cans show how the Holocaust could hide behind ordinary labels and stacked metal boxes. Richard Glucks ran the camp system that joined forced labor with industrialized death. Acromegaly could reshape the face and hands so strongly that even an old portrait looks startling. It is a rare condition caused by too much growth hormone over many years. A Victorian performer born with dwarfism turned her size into international fame and fought being treated like a doll. Her 1863 wedding became such a sensation that it briefly pushed Civil War news off United States front pages. The 504 sit-in turned a federal building in San Francisco into the center of disability rights in 1977. Lasting about 25 days, it helped force Section 504 into effect as the first federal civil rights protection for people with disabilities in the United States. In 1911, William Bumper Harris rode London's new underground escalator to prove the moving stairs were safe when many people still feared them. Harris had one leg, and the stunt helped convince the public to trust one of the newest machines in city life. Pete Moore was born with osteogenesis imperfecta and still built a public career as a performer after breaking about 60 bones in childhood. He later ran his own show for 28 years and married Adina Snyder in 1967. In 1981, saturation divers recovered about 5 tons of Soviet gold from HMS Edinburgh, a British cruiser lost in the Barents Sea in 1942. They lived for weeks under pressure equal to about 800 feet underwater, so they could cut into the wreck and lift the bars out. In May 1945, Soviet troops posed with a victory banner before the ruined Reichstag, a building long seen as a symbol of German state power. The Reichstag became one of the final symbols of Berlin's fall, and images like this soon came to stand for the end of the war in Europe. Before London saw it in 1871, Royal Albert Hall's giant iron and glass dome was built near Manchester and shipped south in sections. The hall opened on 29 March 1871, and its roof quickly became one of Victorian Britain's boldest engineering symbols. These giant penstocks at Boulder Dam were so huge that whole sections had to be built near the site and lowered into Black Canyon by cableway. On October 9, 1936, water rushing through lines like these began sending Hoover Dam power to Los Angeles. The USS Shenandoah looked enormous inside its hangar, and in 1923 it became the first rigid airship built for the United States Navy. Its maiden flight began at Lakehurst on September 4, 1923. Opened at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, the first Ferris wheel turned a maze of iron cables into one of the boldest sights of its age. It stood over 80 meters tall, carried up to 2,160 people in 36 cars, and ran on a 1,000-horsepower steam engine. In Port Said in 1956, Egyptian resistance members gathered in a cramped room during the Suez Crisis. Port Said became the center of the crisis, turning one canal city into world news. In 1898, John Philip Holland climbed from his submarine after a test off Staten Island that helped prove the machine could truly work underwater. During one successful run on March 17, 1898, it stayed submerged for 1 hour 40 minutes. Born in New York City in 1943, Brian Keenan became the drummer for the Chambers Brothers, one of the most distinctive rock and soul groups of the late 1960s. Their signature song, Time Has Come Today, became famous in 1968 for its full version, which ran about 11 minutes. In 1909, Theodore Roosevelt began an African expedition backed by the Smithsonian Institution and the National Geographic Society. The journey filled American museums with thousands of specimens and turned his post-White House travels into world news. In Segovia in 1961, Good Friday marchers passed beneath the city's Roman aqueduct in one of Spain's oldest Easter traditions. The aqueduct behind them was built by the Romans about 2,000 years earlier. In 1956, a boy with a tub of plum beer served ice cream to soldiers beside a train, turning a military stop into a strangely gentle scene. Plum beer was one of the richest Soviet ice creams, made with high milk fat and sold as a prized treat across the country. At the height of his power, Lenin worked in a room with a narrow bed, a plain desk, and almost no decoration. After his death, the Gorky residence was turned into a museum, and much of its old noble interior was removed. In 1897, biochemist Felix Hoffmann prepared acetyl salicylic acid in a form suitable for medicine. That work led to aspirin, a name that soon became one of the most famous drug brands in the world. In Chajma Bay in 1985, a reactor refueling error on submarine K-431 triggered one of the Soviet Navy's worst peacetime nuclear accidents. The blast took 11 lives and spread radioactive contamination around the pier. In 1983, American schoolgirl Samantha Smith arrived in the Soviet Union after a letter to Yuri Andropov made her famous around the world. At just 10 years old, she became one of the clearest child symbols of peace in the Cold War. In 1997, women in a police holding cell were already using mobile phones, a striking sign of how fast the new device had entered daily life. The photo catches an early moment when a mobile phone was not a status symbol, but a direct line out of a locked room. At Cannes in 1997, Luc Besson and Mila Jovovich stood beside costumed aliens from The Fifth Element, making the premiere look like part of the film itself. Released that year, the movie became one of the most visually recognizable science fiction films of the 1990s. In Bosnia in 1996, an American peacekeeper handed part of his field ration to a Russian soldier beside an armored vehicle. Just a few years after the Cold War, two former rivals were sharing food on the same peace mission. On the far left is a young Bruce Willis, still a university student and not yet a film star. The photo catches him before 1988, made his face one of the most recognizable in action cinema. A quiet family bench scene like this became haunting after July 1918, when Russia's former imperial family was killed in Yekaterinburg. Their fall closed more than 300 years of Romanov rule. In 1971, this river raft went into the water with a tent already set on top, ready to become a floating camp. Built with logs and rubber tubes, it carried both shelter and supplies through forest rivers where there were no roads. Manohar Aich won the 1952 Mr. Universe title and later became known as one of the longest-lived champions in bodybuilding. He lived to 104 and kept training deep into old age. Around 1924, a sea of umbrellas filled the grounds of Old Moster Church in Norway, turning a rainy gathering into a powerful pattern of black circles. The church is one of Norway's oldest stone churches and stands on a site tied to the country's early Christian history. General George Patton is shown here with his bull terrier Willie, a rare soft moment beside one of the most hard-driving American commanders of the 1940s. Patton often surrounded himself with strong military symbols. This quiet Chicago house became famous after Al Capone's family moved in during March 1923. Built in 1908 on South Prairie Avenue, it later became one of the most recognized addresses of Prohibition-era America. In 1955, Joseph Taborski hugged his mother after his conviction was overturned and he walked off death row. Just over a year later, he confessed to the 1950 killing and 5 later killings, and Connecticut put him to death in 1960. Ralph Thomas was an Illinois sheriff's deputy in the Prohibition era and a leader against the Ku Klux Klan. In 1925, 3 Klan members attacked him, and he shot all 3 before dying from his wounds. President Harry S. Truman rode through ruined Berlin in 1945, passing streets that still looked crushed by the final collapse of the Third Reich. Only months after the war in Europe ended, the city around him was still a field of broken walls and dust. Louisa Madame Lou Bunch ran one of Central City's most famous houses during Colorado's gold rush. When disease swept through the town, she and the women working with her cared for sick and dying miners. In 1931, Amelia Earhart set an autogyro altitude record of 18,415 feet in a Pitcairn PCA-2. She was the first woman to fly an autogyro, a machine with free-spinning rotor blades that could land in very short spaces. In 1971, Idi Amin seized power in Uganda through a military coup while President Milton Obote was abroad. His rule lasted until 1979 and made him one of the most infamous rulers of the 1970s. In 1945, women and children sat packed together in Kampong Makassar near Batavia, one of the Japanese internment camps in the former Dutch East Indies. More than 3,600 people were held there in less than 1 square kilometer before the war ended. In 1967, a woman used a fire hydrant as a step to kiss a man through a bus window at a Los Angeles depot before he left for basic training. The line of women waiting behind her shows this was not one farewell, but a whole curb full of them. In 1972, Shoichi Yokoi was found on Guam after hiding in the jungle for 28 years after the war had ended. He had survived in a small underground shelter and became one of the most famous Japanese holdouts ever discovered. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.